Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, July the 30th, 2021. I thought I would begin with some poetry, or at least a paraphrase of some poetry. T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, first verse. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. Seems rather appropriate to our current situation, and I'll end the paraphrase of the famous last stanza. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a sniffle. That is where we find ourselves in 2021. In a state of utter panic and in a, how would you say, coalescing, burgeoning belief that we have done something wrong. We don't know what it is, but we don't know what to do now. Alex Berenson writes on Twitter, "We are near a crossroads. Either governments admit the vaccines have huge flaws and cannot be mandated, and lockdowns have failed and are incompatible with freedom, and we all simply must live with COVID going forward, or we end up in a dark place politically and medically. I realize this will require a very painful course correction, but the alternative is so much worse." Now, Berenson mentioned something called the Marek scenario. And I want to explain that. This is from Reddit. "We may reproduce with COVID vaccines on humans what we did on chickens, an imperfect vaccine, allowing very virulent strains to survive on vaccinated hosts, transforming a rather non-dangerous disease into a high fatality one for unvaccinated chickens. And all of this has been studied for decades by very serious and mainstream institutions. Ever hear of Marek's disease? An old chicken's disease before the 1970s. It had mild effect, the worst being paralysis and lesions in neural tissue. Mortality rates were low. A vaccine was then introduced to counter revenue loss. Decades later, the disease has nearly 100% fatality rate among unvaccinated chickens. How could it evolve to be so brutal? How is it even possible to obtain such a high mortality rate? It's very well known that viruses don't want to kill too many hosts if they want to survive. It would be counterproductive and lead to their own extinction. The answer lies in the vaccines. The study's attempts to put an end to years of controversy about a theory. Vaccinated chickens still host the Marek's virus and allows him to mutate freely. It did. According to the study, leaky vaccines are vaccines that prevent the disease but not the transmission. And these chickens' vaccines are leaky vaccines. Thus, even deadly strains can survive and mutate on vaccinated chickens. Over the years, the virus becomes more and more dangerous until it reaches enormous mortality rates for chickens that are unvaccinated. Ranchers must now vaccinate their chickens every year or everything will be wiped out in a few days by Marek's disease. Now, are chickens leaky, imperfect? Most of the vaccines we use are perfect. Forgive a misuse of the word. I'm not an English native and could not find the translation. For example, the smallpox, which doesn't allow the disease to survive in the body of the host. This vaccine is very well known to have eradicated the disease, one of the greatest achievements of medicine. But some are imperfect or leaky, most notably the flu vaccine. Flu-vaccinated people can still transmit the disease, and it strikes me, I remember how every few years we said the flu was always worse. Note that very few people were vaccinated against flu every year, mostly elders. Was it enough to slowly create a living pool where dangerous strains lived happy? Imagine a whole population vaccinated, creating a gigantic pool. Yes, that could be COVID vaccinated people. It's very hard right now to find serious studies to evaluate how leaky the COVID vaccine is. Well, I guess we'll find out. It's a very strange situation that we find ourselves in, that we were told over and over again by our leaders last year. Once again, just hang on, just pull together. The vaccines are coming, and the vaccines will solve the COVID problem. We will be able to get back to normal. So large numbers of people all over the world, particularly the Western world, were vaccinated. And what happened after that? What happened after that is that the virus mutated, as all viruses mutate, which gave us the deadly Delta variant, which is apparently now a potentially world-ending crisis, despite the vaccine. And the latest is that so-called fully vaccinated people are transmitting the disease to others. Furthermore, we are told, beginning in Israel, and this will be coming to all countries, presumably, that 2 jabs is not enough, that we need 3 or perhaps more. And of course, one must mention, as always, that the mRNA vaccines are not vaccines as traditionally understood. They are experimental gene therapy, which were issued under an emergency authorization because clinical testing has not finished, and the original clinical testing was botched because the placebo group was then vaccinated. Let's go to the New York Times on this. This is from well-known fear-monger Apurva Mandavili. Vaccinated people may spread the virus, though rarely, CDC reports. The proof is an outbreak in Provincetown, Massachusetts, the agency said, but published internal documents paint an even more harrowing picture. See, a great many people seem to be really enjoying this. That is to say, perhaps they are secretly longing for the end of the world, or at least, as they say, the end of the world as we know it. Here is a piece from Roger Kimball in Spectator Australia. The great thing about COVID, I like to quip, is that it has abolished death from old age. Also the flu. That malady typically claims 30 to 40,000 scalps per annum in the US, many more in a bad year. How many flu deaths were there last season, according to the Scientific American? 700. Find yourself in a motorcycle accident, suffering the inconvenience of losing your cerebellum and all that other gooey stuff spread like jam over the interstate? Don't worry. The medics will find an intact nostril and will determine that you tested positive for COVID. What remains of you will be transported to a hospital where management will file a claim and get 15% more in their government reimbursement because you died from, or at least with, COVID. There are exceptions, of course. I'm told that St. George Floyd, for example, tested positive for COVID, but too late. Not too late because he had expired, but too late because a racism narrative intervened and took priority. I thought we'd be well beyond the Wuhan flu by now. Yes, it probably came from a Chinese virology lab, one where gain of function, i.e. bioweaponization, research generously funded by St. Anthony Fauci's NIH was taking place, but you're not supposed to say that. The Chinese don't like to have it bruited about publicly, so I won't say it. But I thought we would be beyond it because, after all, it is a seasonal respiratory virus that ebbs and flows and is definitely on the ebb now. But what about cue scary music? What about the Delta variant? They should have called it the Andromeda strain for all the carefully cultivated, and deliberately fanned panic its advent has occasioned. Here's a biology lesson. Viruses mutate. They can't help it. It's in their nature. Perhaps the so-called Delta variant is more communicable. So what? It is also markedly less deadly. But. There's a great surge in people testing positive for COVID. Again, so what? Testing positive signifies nothing. It really is a tale told by an idiot, many idiots. What if the people who run our lives, who bark at you on public transport to put on a face diaper, who pontificate from state capitals about who can eat in restaurants, go to the theater, travel on airplanes, what if they started testing for your ordinary run-of-the-mill coronaviruses, the ones that are responsible for the common cold? Want to bet there would be an a great number of positives? It's Rahm Emanuel time now and forever. Never let a good crisis go to waste, he advised. And rest assured, they, the alphabet soup of pod people who we put in charge of our lives, they have run with it big time. A couple of days ago, the White House, how long before they changed the insulting name of that edifice, announced that because of the Delta variant, they would not be lifting travel restrictions at this point. They hope, of course, that they can maintain and perhaps stiffen the restriction indefinitely, maybe forever. After all, as the White House press secretary demanded a week or two back, why do you need to have that information? For the time being, the U.S. then will continue to restrict non-essential travel for non-U.S. citizens from several countries around the world. As I've said before, my dream job is to be the chap who decides whose travel, whose job, whose business, whose livelihood is essential. Of course, that task, deciding what is essential and what is not absolutely essential, falls to all the politicians and their phalanx of busybody bureaucrats enforcing the diktats that keep us little folk in line for our own good. It goes without saying. It certainly does. It is not true, at least as far as I know, that not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki was an employee of the East German Stasi, though possibly that was her dream as a little girl. If things keep going as they have been, she may get her chance right here at home. And I'm going to read from an article in the American Sun by Hank Oslo, which gives us a very nice metaphor. Have you ever dealt with someone that has a serious drug problem? It is one of the most frustrating experiences you will encounter because most of the cliches end up being true. Rapidly, the person is subsumed to their addiction until it is very much the drugs talking. This manifests as an instrumental approach to truth. Hey, can I borrow your wife's car? I gotta pick up some furniture. Yeah, no, she said it was cool. Why are you being a dick, man? I'll be back in like a couple of hours. I mean, sure, I could use mine. I just need some gas money. I left my wallet at home with my car. Yeah, I took the bus. No, he's just a friend. I'm just doing a favor. It's cool. It's fine. Just let me use your bathroom quick. What? No, I don't know what happened to your motorcycle. Why am I always such a bad guy? It's like you don't want to help your own brother. Man, maybe you have a problem. What happens is that every claim is laser focused on the actual priority. Trivial and reciprocal favors build up to more significant cooperation, but it is because it is not continuously goal-oriented that you can generally trust people you've known for a while to not put on a years-long facade building up to a big grift. The sheer difficulty of doing so means that you find yourself able to discern character and notice when things are out of character. When communication becomes purely instrumental, and the only question is, what do I need to say in order to get my next fix? There is no character left. If you find yourself convinced by a junkie on an object level, totally believable they're out of gas, to be honest, you merely need to calibrate in light of the fact that they will say anything in order to get what they want. Which brings us to politics. It is well known that politicians and various apparatchiks deep in the bowels of government departments are junkies for power. When they realize there is a kilo's worth squirreled away inside some crisis, they will move heaven and earth in order to crack it open and spike it straight. What do I need to say in order to convince you? This is orthogonal to the truth. We saw this dynamic play out repeatedly with COVID, and Hank Oslo has a screenshot of a tweet from February 29th, 2020 from the U.S. Surgeon General, which reads, quote, "Seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not effective in preventing general public from catching coronavirus, but if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk, exclamation point, end of quotation." Back to Oslo. Did you know masks don't work or only work once your RN certificate comes in? Cloth masks do nothing for anyone. Even N95 have too much risk of cross-contamination if you screw up your donning and doffing. It's very dangerous. Wait, actually, no. What if I told you a face rag was the only thing standing between you and death? It's okay. Anyone can do it. Don't bother with N95 still. You just need the cloth. 2 pieces of cloth, actually. But not a particle filter. But not if you're vaccinated, then you can't catch it. Actually, no. Silly, of course you can still get it. No one ever said that. You're misinterpreting what we said. It just lessens the symptoms. But you can still spread it. But you shouldn't be tested if you've been vaxxed. That would confuse the issue. You keep misunderstanding what we never said. Can I borrow $10? The U.S. government still hasn't gotten their story straight on their actions just regarding the masked aspect of the COVID debacle, but has claimed at various points that we never said masks don't work. You misinterpreted what we said. We were lying to the public about mask efficacy to preserve supply. The science changed, meaning our entire understanding of respiratory infections up to that point was very confidently wrong. And the science didn't change. The virus evolved to be more infectious, but also more preventable via masks. No one at any point was fired for getting it wrong or lauded for getting it right, because to these power junkies, communications with the public are a means to an end. Even the notion of credibility is treated as a chip to be cashed in when you need to tell a particularly glaring lie. The science exists purely to be cited to justify a preordained policy, and actually reading its contents is somewhere between discouraged and illegal, to the extent it isn't just fabricated wholesale during data collection. Such circumstances don't mean there isn't a danger, just as the disheveled man hawking catalytic converters may just be a humble auto scrapper. But it does mean it's impossible to merely take their word for it, decontextualized from the fact that you're dealing with liars. If they wanted to be taken seriously, they would mea culpa with a costly signal, making a list of people wronged and where possible amends. New York nursing homes might be a good place to start. Failing that, the only people they can appeal to are those who would rather engage in wishful thinking and live in a world where they don't have a serious problem. Again, that is from Hank Oslo, July 29th at theamericansun.com. Let's see what Jim Kunstler has to say. His column today is called Things Get Ripe. Besides trying to just live their lives in these days of socioeconomic meltdown, which God knows is hard enough, the people can barely sort out the seemingly malevolent intentions of the folks in charge of the monster that government has become. And so the question arises, are they actually trying to kill us all, or are they so corrupt and stupid that everything they touch falls apart? In other words, is it mastermindery or cluster fuckery? So there's a bunch of stuff that he writes about that I can't say because I will be canceled immediately. But he does talk about what's going on in Washington. The world has never seen the launch of such a gigantic lead balloon. All week the hysteria has been building. Another balloon is falling to earth as the CDC prepares to announce that the vaccines are a bust against the Delta variant, and it's back to the drawing board for all the toiling myrmidons of Big Pharma. Did House Speaker Nancy Pelosi get some inside info on this, having appointed herself masked sheriff of the U.S. Capitol building, threatening now to arrest non-masked members and their staffers? Indeed, even a few fully vaxxed up Congress people were moved to shout, "Hey, wait a minute." Pelosi, meanwhile, is busy orchestrating her national sob story to prove that half the country are domestic terrorists for trespassing in her office and need to be canceled, especially the former president behind that dastardly insurrection, against whom criminal referrals will be shortly forthcoming to Merrick Garland's Department of Justice, as if one can only think. As if, that is, the half of America not lost in the transports of wokery and fantasies of half-assed communism are going to roll over for it. Please pull a pin on that grenade, Nancy, you demented, disquising old jade. America's had enough of you and your mendacious machinations, and of your sidekick, the sham president, Joe Biden, and his pitiful mummeries in the service of a claque that wants to destroy what little remains of the public interest and our national honor. You have no idea, Nancy, how all this is going to blow up in your face and leave you a figure of historic odium. Well, Jim Kunstler tends to be very white-pilled on people responsible for wrecking things, getting their comeuppance. I know people mock him for this, but what's the alternative? So, did you know that there's a war on? That's something that people heard a lot during World War II. Is this trip really necessary? Don't you know there's a war on? In other words, anything which is not completely devoted to the war effort, to killing Germans and Japanese, is sinful, in fact. Now, we are not quite there with COVID-19, but we're getting there. And Hollywood has been affected. Yes, those super patriots in Hollywood. This is from Breitbart News, from Associated Press. Scarlett Johansson is suing the Walt Disney Company over its streaming release of Black Widow, which she said breached her contract and deprived her of potential earnings. In a lawsuit filed Thursday in Los Angeles Superior Court, the Black Widow star and executive producer said her contract guaranteed an exclusive theatrical release. The Wall Street Journal first reported the news of the lawsuit. Johansson's potential earnings were tied to the box office performance of the film, which the company released simultaneously in theaters and is on its streaming service Disney Plus for a $30 rental. In the months leading up to the lawsuit, Johansson gave Disney and Marvel every opportunity to right their wrong and make good on Marvel's promise, according to the lawsuit. Disney intentionally induced Marvel's breach of the agreement without justification in order to prevent Johansson from realizing the full benefit of her bargain with Marvel. Disney said the lawsuit has no merit whatsoever. And I read from this statement by Disney, and I thought, again, life is full of surprises, because I thought they wouldn't dare go down that road. The lawsuit is especially sad and distressing in its callous disregard for the horrific and prolonged global effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, the Walt Disney Company, champions of humanity. Disney has fully complied with Johansson's contract, and furthermore, the release of Black Widow on Disney Plus with Premier Access has significantly enhanced her ability to earn additional compensation on top of the $20 million she has received to date. After its release was delayed more than a year because of COVID-19, Black Widow debuted to a pandemic best of $80 million in North America and $78 million from international theaters 3 weeks ago, but theatrical grosses declined sharply after that. In its second weekend in release, the National Association of Theater Owners issued a rare statement criticizing the strategy, asserting that simultaneous release lends itself only to lost profits and higher quality piracy. And I was thinking, if you've ever seen Barton Fink, and the end of that movie, featuring the great Michael Lerner as a studio chief, are we going to see Bob Iger, the executive chairman of Disney, arrayed in some phony general's uniform with some fruit salad on his chest? I wouldn't be surprised. Now, people might be asked, why are you interested in a very wealthy actress complaining that she didn't get enough money? Well, Hollywood looks to cheat everybody, from, humble scriptwriters to showrunners, to actors, actresses, everybody. And because, they're the executives and they deserve all the money, or certainly the lion's share of it. Why exactly is an interesting question. Let's look at Kathleen Kennedy. Did her interventions in the Star Wars franchise, were they particularly successful? Were they particularly successful with the fans or at the box office? Has Kathleen Kennedy ever come up with a good idea in her life? I know lots of people hate Steven Spielberg, but he knows a lot about movies and what makes them work. I was reminded a couple of days ago, I was writing some tweets about Galaxy Quest and how much I love it. Then Steven Spielberg was looking over the production, and there was this black-haired alien called Leilani, and he said, you should boost her part. So then a love interest was found for her, and it's a very good idea. It actually made the picture better. I have not heard of a single good idea that Kathleen Kennedy has ever come up with in her decades-long career. She just associated with people more talented than her right from the very beginning, and she rode this nepotism to the top or close to it. It could be that Scarlett Johansson has made a big mistake, because it is well known that you do not want to get on the wrong side of Disney. They will destroy you, given that after their takeover of Fox, which should never have been allowed, they now control something like about 92% of movie releases, which is a monopoly, which are supposed to be illegal under antitrust law in the United States. But no one dares to stand in the way of the devil mouse. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Dan, Anrun, Brandon Smith, Chogokin 666, the epistemic certainty of the mediocre woke into slumber. Anrun, well, thank you for your compliment. Brandon Smith says, quiet desperation except for the Karens. Chogokin 666, KMG is Kurtz. We're all chickens, says Brandon Smith. Clownvelt says, KMG has a far higher tolerance for horror than Mr. Kurtz. COVIDians love their sunken cost fallacy, says Dan. Indeed they do. But everyone seems to be in love with sunken cost fallacies. Why was the United States, Canada, and Britain, why did they stay so long in Afghanistan? Well, you look at the investment that we made. How has that investment paid off so far? Well, no, we have a plan. Well, if your plan is anything short than outright genocide, it is not going to work. You tried a similar thing in Vietnam. How long did that go on for? It pretty much wrecked America. And then you decide to do the same thing in Afghanistan with the same, well, not the same, but the same level of witless generals saying, well, just give us more time, more troops, more money. We have a new plan. Well, I guess, if you don't fight for victory, you can't expect to win. Hello, Steve, who mentions the Vax Americana. That's nice. That's nice. Oscar Toe says, I don't understand the new CDC data. 4 to 5 hospitalized had the vax, and they're calling that a win because they didn't die. I'll have more on that shortly. Shouldn't they, not get hospitalized in the first place? Dan says that's how it was advertised. Contiki Roulette said, I saw a strange article about an Olympic athlete imprisoned in a room who wanted fresh air because of positive tests. That was the story, not that an athlete in perfect health was imprisoned. Well, the Japanese seem to have gone completely nuts over COVID-19. Imagine holding an Olympics without any spectators. Now, famously, there is a lot of rumpy-pumpy that goes on at the Olympics. I mean, it's notorious. They're all supposed to be in a bubble. I suspect that these, how should I put it, to be crude, horny athletes are going to find any way to burst the bubble in aid of their rumpy-pumpy. Enron says, disappointed with Kunstler letting the various James Bond villains off the hook a little today. Yes, I didn't read that part, but I know what you mean. But on the other hand, it could be that they are simply world leaders pretend. Anyone get the reference? Matt Forney says, remasks, the Mexican state where I've lived tried to make outdoor masks mandatory last year. The police arrested a guy who wasn't wearing a mask and couldn't afford the fine, then tortured him to death. That sounds a lot like Mexico. People started rioting in response, and during the riots, one protester poured lighter fluid on a cop while his back was turned and then tossed a match. Next day, the government abolished the mask law. Okay, do we have anyone new? Hello to Birkin Sultanov. Oh no, she wasn't able to make more comic book movie garbage. Actually, I know a lot of people hate Scarlett Johansson, but I rather like her. She's a good-looking woman who can act. I've seen her do good work in many movies. I suppose, if enormous amounts of money are going to be waved at people, they're going to take it, given how fragile a Hollywood career is. I wish it wasn't this way, but here we are. But it could be, that one of the collateral, movie theaters are obviously collateral damage of COVID-19, and Marvel movies might be collateral damage, because if they can't expect people to pay, the big bucks in the theaters, then they can't spend all the money for these films, and they can't expect, just $1 billion plus as a matter of course, which is a good thing. Mary Crow says, this is headed towards St. John's work. The alternative is to pray the rosary. Arm yourself with prayer. I see Kevin's work as one crying in the wilderness with laughter. God bless him. Well, thank you so much, and God bless you. Brandon Smith, is Black Widow another Disney princess movie? I've just seen what the Red Letter Media review and the review on the Pitch Meeting parody, and I don't see that it really has any purpose. Again, yet another origin story. How about moving forward rather than continually moving backwards and answering a bunch of questions that nobody really cared about? But of course, they're making these movies for nerds. And the way that these movies have typically made $1 billion plus is nerds going over and over again to the theaters. Now, of course, nerds tend to be one of the groups that is most afflicted with COVID hysteria. In any event, TV screens, with 4K, a 60-inch or bigger TV screen, and 5.1 or 6.1 or 7.1 sound systems. Is there any significant difference from your home theater setup to a movie theater, apart from the fact that in your home theater setup, you can just invite your friends or choose to watch it alone instead of being in a theater full of people who will not get off their smartphones? Okay. Dan says, today Disney mandated all employees be vaxxed within the next few months or they will be terminated. And Stephen Costanza, surprised Disney hasn't tried to ruin Lord of the Rings. Well, that's coming. It's coming. It's going to be more relevant and diverse and possibly gay. That's what I have heard. No Use says Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a good conservative movie. I'm very fond of that movie, I must say. People say it has its longeurs, but the movie set in 1969, and I was 14 years old in 1969, and it is a remarkable recreation of what 1969 was like. Was it necessary for Brad Pitt, to drive down the Strip block after block after block with faithful recreations of the movie theaters and the restaurants and the like that were there? I don't know that it was necessary, but it sure looked good. It was real. That's one of the reasons why it looked good. People on Twitter today are raving about some new movie. There's Ryan Reynolds in it. if it has Ryan Reynolds in it, it could not possibly be a good movie by definition. But there was a poster shot or whatever, more uncanny valley CGI. CGI doesn't have to look horrible. I was watching a clip, in 4K, of the famous attack on the Planet P, the outpost, from Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, and the CGI of the bugs looks amazing. A lot of it has to do with lighting and such like, or say a director with the nous and the power to say, no, you're not going to do all this stuff before I get on board, okay? Because this is my movie, and I'm going to be involved on whether this looks good or looks like rubbish. Sorry, that's seven Costanza. Of course, Kunstler had a good interview last week. Kevin, did you watch the Milius doc? Do you recommend Big Wednesday? I have not seen Big Wednesday. I will watch the Milius doc this weekend. I like Scarlet and Under the Skin, says Oscar Toe. Yes, I like Scarlet and Under the Skin very much. And that movie was made by one of my most favorite directors, Jonathan Glazer. But Jonathan Glazer isn't allowed to make very many movies. I've loved all of the movies that he has made, particularly the second one, A Birth, which was killed by a phony clickbait pedophilia scandal. But you should check out his ads on YouTube, particularly his ads for Stella Artois. There's two that have priests in them for some reason, and of course they're beautifully shot because it is Jonathan Glazer, but they are very funny as well. Let's get back to it here. And I'm not done with COVID-19 because, it seems to be the end of the world, or some people are thinking so, or the people who run the world think that it could be the end of the world. So I feel obligated to discuss it further. And everyone has to be vaccinated, apparently. I don't. Whether it is legal to force people in private enterprises to be vaccinated is an interesting question. I simply don't trust the judiciary. Oh, yes, the Federalist Society will talk about the Constitution, the Constitution, the Constitution. Yeah? Well, I don't trust them. John Roberts couldn't be arsed to find a constitutional objection to the state of California banning religious observances. Yeah, that's how much of a strict constructionist John Roberts is. This is the guy who found a taxing power hidden in the Constitution. It had been hidden there. This is to justify Obamacare. It had been hidden there for over 200 years. Now, one would have thought that over the course of more than 200 years, the Congress of the United States found a novel way to gouge more money out of Americans, it would have leapt on it. No, but this required the genius, the jurisprudential genius of John Roberts. This is from military.com. President Joe Biden Thursday said he has ordered the military to start taking steps toward making the COVID-19 vaccine mandatory for uniformed service members. I wonder how many will leave as a result. This is from the Associated Press today. President Biden Thursday announced sweeping new pandemic requirements aimed at boosting vaccination rates for millions of federal workers and contractors as he lamented the, quote, American tragedy of rising yet preventable deaths among the unvaccinated. How about rising yet preventable deaths among the vaccinated? Federal workers will be required to sign forms attesting they've been vaccinated against the coronavirus or else comply with new rules on mandatory masking, weekly testing, distancing, and more. The strict new guidelines are aimed at increasing sluggish vaccination rates among the huge number of Americans who draw federal paychecks and to set an example for private employers around the country. My word, how much I hate language like that. This is from, a scratchy throat, sore throat this week, and of course, speaking 2 hours a day is not 2 hours a day straight is not particularly helpful for it, but I do not repine and soldier on. From Hannah Blow at Breitbart, the Centers for Disease Control appear to be in panic mode over its messaging, according to an internal document, highlighting the federal agency's desire to ramp up its vaccine and masking pushes while millions of Americans question the agency's agenda and the science behind the latest guidance. The internal document, which the Washington Post obtained, reportedly shows the health agency confessing a need to revamp its public messaging to coerce Americans to get vaccinated, touting it as the, quote, best defense against a variant so contagious that it acts almost like a different novel virus. According to the outlet, one of the slides featured in the internal presentation points to higher virus risk rates for older age groups than younger, a fact that has remained consistent throughout the pandemic, even among vaccinated individuals. Yes, we've known this for a year and a half. But the media doesn't want to talk about this, and the governments don't want to talk about it. If the average age of death is 80 or 85, yeah, well, it's sad when anyone dies. But how long did these people expect to live? Yes, Michael Rappaport, unlikely voice of reason. Are you familiar with this fellow? This actor? What? Wigger? White rapper? Quite one of the most obnoxious people in the entertainment business. This again from a Breitbart, this time by Catherine Hamilton. Actor Michael Rappaport took to TikTok Wednesday to trash Dr. Anthony Fauci and the CDC for their mixed messaging on Chinese coronavirus vaccines. Quote, I just watched Tony Fauci on CNN and Fox tell me that people with the vaccine, vaccinated people, are now spreading the coronavirus. I went from being a hero because I'm vaccinated, and now you MFers are calling me a super spreader. I ain't no effing super spreader. Well put, Michael Rappaport. That's all I can say. And, okay, let's go to the New York Times. Vaccine hesitancy. Yes, this is a type of story that the New York Times especially loves. Let's interview some neo-Nazis, supposedly some big name in neo-Nazism, who no one's ever heard of. And he's had a Damascene conversion. And not only does he regret the horrible things that he did that no one knows about, but now he is an evangelist for the right kind of politics. And he's making bank on that. This is from Jack Healy at the Times. They spurned the vaccine. Now they want you to know they regret it. People who once rejected the vaccine or simply waited too long are now grappling with the consequences, often in raw, public ways. As this is a Dateline Provo, Utah, as Mindy Green spent another day in the COVID intensive care unit listening to the whirring machines that now breathe for her 42-year-old husband, Russ. She opened her phone and tapped out a message. We did not get the vaccine, she wrote on Facebook. I read all kinds of things about the vaccine, and it scared me. So I made the decision and prayed about it and got the impression that we would be okay. They were not. Her husband, the father to their 4 children, was now hovering between life and death, tentacles of tubes spilling from his body. The patient in the room next to her husband's had died hours earlier. That day, July the 13th, Green decided to add her voice to an unlikely group of people speaking out in the polarized national debate over vaccination, the remorseful. If I had the information I have today, we would have gotten vaccinated, Green wrote. Come what may, she hit send. Yes, because 42-year-old people never die. Well, as it turns out, 42-year-old people or 32-year-old people or 22-year-old people or 12-year-old people often die of things which might seem inexplicable. That is the nature of human existence. Curiously, there is a picture of Mr. Green. We don't see his face, But we see him up to his neck, and we see a bunch of tubes, some thin, some large, and we see that he is quite overweight. Quite overweight. Now, we have known right from the very beginning that the most proximate cause of getting COVID, if you are, say, under 70 or especially under 80, is being obese, particularly morbid obese. But does this story mention that? That the unfortunate Mr. Green suffers from a very serious, what they call comorbidity? No, of course not. Why would the New York Times mention something which would be actually highly useful to people not suffering and possibly dying from COVID-19, which is, if you are overweight, lose weight? No, why would they do that? This is from Andrew Mark Miller at Fox News. President Biden grew heated Thursday while defending his administration's flip-flop on whether vaccinated Americans need to wear masks. Fox News' Peter Doocy pressed Biden about his administration's reversal, pointing to the president's statement in May that, quote, if you are fully vaccinated, you no longer need to wear a mask, unquote. In May, you made it seem like the vaccine was the ticket to losing the mask forever, Doocy pointed out. That was true at the time, Biden shouted, because I thought there were people that were going to understand that getting vaccinated made a dramatic difference. And what happened was the new variant came along. They didn't get vaccinated. It spread more rapidly and more people were getting sick. That's the difference. Of course, this is the same man who said that 99.5% of those people getting COVID are unvaccinated, which is, who knows? Pudding brain, Biden gets told stuff. Sometimes he remembers it. Sometimes he doesn't. He could be lying. Biden is a notorious liar. This is from Marissa Schultz at Fox News. U.S. Capitol Police were ordered to arrest visitors and staff who refused to wear a mask on the House side of the Capitol complex, according to a police memo issued by new USCP Chief Thomas Manger that was obtained by a member of Congress. Police were also advised not to arrest members of Congress for failing to wear masks, but to report the lawmakers' noncompliance to the House Sergeant at Arms. The memo says House members have been subjected to fines starting at $500 for skirting mask rules. Representative Kat Kamak, Republican of Florida, got a copy of the memo distributed at Thursday's morning roll call from an unnamed police officer. She told Fox News police she's spoken to are very uncomfortable with this new directive that Kamak describes as tyrannical. Yes, I wonder how that is going to play out. Could get ugly. Oh, and it's softening us up for the big kill. A very long piece from CBC News by Sasa Petricic. Political violence related to COVID-19 could lead to unraveling of societies worldwide, observers say. The gist of this piece, as I understand it, is anti-COVID violence bad, pro-George Floyd, anti-inequality violence good. So you just keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind. Oh, wait. Canada could be seeing the start of a variant-driven fourth wave. Go fourth wave. We got to keep this going. Keep the faith, baby. Someone who calls himself Eden at EH_DEN got a hold of the Pfizer manufacturing and supply agreement. And there's a Twitter thread read app on this, and it is very interesting. It is very interesting indeed. The nature of the contract is essentially Pfizer is always right. There is nothing that we could possibly do vis-a-vis our jab that is actionable. If we screw up, you pay. If we don't deliver, you pay. Just under no circumstances will Pfizer be subject to or liable for any late delivery penalties. Pfizer will not in any circumstances accept any returns of product or any dose. No product returns may take place under any circumstances. Now for the big secret, $12 per dose for about 250,000 units. Funny that this is the price for a small amount of dosages when Pfizer was charging the US $19.50 per dose. So US taxpayers got screwed by Pfizer, probably also Israel. About the payment, the country has no right to withhold, offset, recoup, or debit any amounts owed to Pfizer, whether under this agreement or otherwise, against any other amount owed or to become due or owing to it by Pfizer or a Pfizer affiliate. And it goes on and on. And oh, I like this one. Purchaser acknowledges the long-term effects and efficacy of the vaccine are not currently known, and that there may be adverse effects of the vaccine that are not currently known. I'll repeat that. Purchaser acknowledges the long-term effects and efficacy of the vaccine are not currently known, and that there may be adverse effects of the vaccine that are not currently known. How about that? They certainly seem to be underselling their jab, wouldn't you say? And of course, COVID-19 has been used as an excuse to shut people up, just like what happened in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And you see how these two things are converging. You see how actually it seems like everything is converging. This is from Matt Lamb at LifeSite News. Twitter has suspended political commentator Dave Rubin for 12 hours after he said that a sane society would pause on pushing vaccination. Quote, they want a federal vaccine mandate for vaccines which are clearly not working as promised just weeks ago. People are getting and transmitting COVID despite vax, plus now they're prepping us for booster shots. A sane society would take a pause. We do not live in a sane society. The openly homosexual talk show host, this is LifeSite. This is a Catholic site. You know, is it really necessary to mention that he's openly homosexual? Is this an attempt to show how broad-minded they are? And I suppose I have to be careful about this one as well. This is from Neville Hodgkinson at theconservativewoman.co.uk, which has done excellent work, doing excellent work. Israel's 9 million people and Gibraltar's 34,000 are among the most COVID-19 vaccinated in the world, almost entirely using the Pfizer mRNA injection. But after a fall in cases, both communities are once again seeing a rapid rise in infections. Sacrifices made in life and liberty are beginning to look less worthwhile, a fact that French legislators seem to have overlooked this week in requiring COVID vaccine passports for a wide range of normal life activities. Less attention was given to the fact that Gibraltar suffered the highest COVID mortality rate in the world proportional to its small population during the first 3 weeks of a vaccine rollout that began January 10th this year. Today, Gibraltar is experiencing a surge in breakthrough infections. Across Israel, there are now 14,365 confirmed cases, described as skyrocketing by the Israeli newspaper Arutz Shiva. Of those, 258 are in hospital, 153 in a serious condition, and 35 are critically ill. It has not been revealed how many of these cases had received the vaccine. More than 5 million Israelis have had both doses, but vaccine hesitancy has grown as news of the apparent dangers has spread and the rate of full vaccination has slowed to a crawl. A study by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, reported this week by the Times of Israel, indicated, however, a fall in the Pfizer vaccine's effectiveness over time, with those vaccinated in January having just 16% protection against infection now. Since elderly people who respond less to the vaccine were amongst the first to receive the jab, that failure is unlikely to be as great across the population as a whole. Nevertheless, the phenomenon of so-called breakthrough infections is causing mounting concern in the scientific community. Well, I guess there's an easy solution to this problem, which is to simply stop counting the cases. And here is a report from the most effeminate country in the Western world, Sydney readies for the army as lockdown fails to squash Delta outbreaks. You know how many people have died of COVID-19 in the whole country of Australia this year? 1, 2. 2. Yes, that certainly calls for armed intervention. Does it not? Does it not? You heard a lot of people talking about war. This is a war. Don't you know we're in a war? They actually use that, war. You know what happens in wars? There's friendly fire deaths and there's collateral damage. And, people who are in areas that are occupied by your enemy, a lot of them tend to get killed as you seek to reclaim that territory. This war metaphor is most inappropriate, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps we were being softened up. And we will go to Lockdown Skeptics, aka dailyskeptic.org. Why isn't it all over bar the shouting? Why aren't we back to normal yet? Positive COVID tests, as reported by Public Health England, declined again yesterday to 29,622 after 2 days of going up a bit. Either way, all eyes are on the data to see what will happen next. But should they be? After all, what now are we waiting for? All the vulnerable and more are vaccinated, and the vaccines appear to give a decent enough protection from serious disease and death. Or even if they don't, there's nothing more that can be done. So we might as well go back to normal anyway, and the virus will do whatever it does, and the vaccines will do whatever they do. This was the decision made by Premier Jason Kenney of Alberta, and you have heard me say many unkind things about Jason Kenney over the last year and a half, but I must salute him for embracing sanity at long last. Confusion over whether cases are rising or falling. Tens of thousands of Brits won't tell NHS Test and Trace who they've come into contact with. Quite wise. The controversial contact tracing system made 250,000 calls in the 7-day spell ending July 21st, making it the busiest week since the darkest period of the second wave in January, the pingdemic, they're calling it. Beep, 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 beep. You have to isolate. Now, you have to go home, shut yourself away, because your smartphone is ordering you to do so. NHS admits that 25% of patients with COVID were admitted for something else. Oh, and here's the lunatic who runs the Philippines. His name is Rodrigo Duterte. For all I care, you can die anytime. Philippine president's message to the unvaccinated. Brits must get vaccinated if they want to travel internationally again, says Transport Secretary Grant Shapps. Yes, and let's go back to Alex Berenson, and we're going to enjoy him on Twitter while he is still allowed to be on Twitter. Okay, never seen this before. Twitter pulled the misleading tag from last night's post about the Pfizer death data, and let's see what he wrote. That 15 patients who received the vaccine, this is of the test. 15 patients who received the vaccine died, 14 who received placebo died. The end. The trial blind is broken now. This is all the data we will ever have. Yes, does nothing to reduce the overall risk of death. Nothing. Yeah. And this is from their own reporting, Pfizer's own reporting. But Twitter put a message saying that this was misinformation or disinformation. Berenson says the problem with lying, as much as they've been lying, is that even when they make honest mistakes, it seems like they're lying. Wow, I thought this might be a deep fake. Nope, it's just the old science from May, when Fauci and the CDC thought dropping mask rules would get people to be vaccinated, not to be confused with the new science from this week when they've realized they were wrong. Science. Bulletin from Dr. Anthony Fauci, still looking good for the Nobel, right? Bulletin from Dr. Anthony Fauci. Attention citizens, your Department of Pandemia wishes to inform you that we have always been at war with the Delta variant. Attention citizens. Oh, and here's some information from CNN. Vaccination alone won't stop the rise of variants and in fact could push the evolution of strains that evade their protection, researchers warned. They said people need to wear masks and take other preventative steps until almost everyone is vaccinated. Berenson comments, now they tell us, those of us who didn't read UT4. Anyway, vaccination alone won't stop the rise of variants and in fact could push the evolution of strains that evade their protection. I'm stunned. I'm stunned. Why would you go ahead with it then, if that was the case? I don't want to, scare people with the, Marek's chicken, but they're just admitting it straight up now. Kind of shocking. And here's a sad story from The Guardian. And guess what? It has to do with apps. Remember apps? Everyone loves apps. Everyone has, dozens or hundreds of apps on their phone, which they don't use. Of course, now we find out that apps are there to control every aspect of our lives. Aimee Therese tweets, Silicon Valley libs fell for Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos' lies because they want apps to keep everyone contained in a little box. Secure, safe, subordinated, suicidal. The world of we care apps and constant surveillance they are creating is monstrous. All care, no responsibility. We don't deserve this. New app places U.S. caregivers under digital surveillance. Electronic visit verification systems make home care more difficult and trap people with disabilities. Advocacy groups and people with disabilities warned from the start that EVV systems would erode clients' autonomy, make home care more difficult, and threaten the progress of the disability rights and independent living movements. At the heart of these disagreements are clients and workers, often women of color and immigrants who feel as if they're constantly surveilled and under suspicion. The move to EVV has also made the jobs of family and live-in caregivers more difficult. But the real problem is that EVV's inflexibility adds new and seemingly arbitrary responsibilities to an already demanding job. Someone interviewed called Morel has to clock in and out of the app as often as 4 times a day on a fixed schedule, even though Carolyn gets care whenever she needs it, not at predetermined times. She sets alarms on her phone, terrified she'll miss a clock in because she is preparing meals or helping Carolyn to the bathroom. Her mother, who is Carolyn's legal representative, has to sign the app at the end of every day. I suppose there were people at the time that said that cell phones, and especially smartphones, were going to be our digital dictators. Well, guess what? There's another ridiculous slippery slope argument, right? Because, I only got a cell phone of any kind 2 years ago. And the only reason I got it is because Twitter and PayPal pretty much held a gun to my head and say, do this or else. So I did. And how much money have I spent? $1,500, say, for a phone. How many conversations do I have on this phone? 1 or 2 a week. But it was necessary. But yes, they control our lives now. And here's a heartwarming story, or revolting according to taste. This is from Mediaite. Jamie Lee Curtis shares that her child is transgender. We watched in wonder and pride as our son became our daughter. Sounds like something from one of those body horror films, but no. Jamie Lee Curtis has been in a number of horror films, of course. I don't know that she's been in any body horror films. And yes, so this trans person, what does this person do for a living? Guess what? It's in the computer business. Yeah, how about that? Big shocker there. I mean, I certainly didn't see that coming. I don't know the extent to which you've noticed that famous people end up having transgender children. Have you noticed this? Because there's what are we up to now? We're up to close to 10 very famous people. Let's go to the chat. Kontiki Roulette, we're occupied by the same idiot freaks that the Afghan men just booted out. Well played, Afghan men. Props to them. Yes, the people that we were allied with in Afghanistan were the Bachi-Bazi crowd. The old men who rape boys. Yeah, the T-boys. They raped them. That's their tradition, and it wasn't, up to us to interfere with the tradition. Also heroin, poppy fields, because that's their tradition. It's only a tradition since that dam was built in the 1940s by the Americans that turned the surrounding soil so saline that the only thing that could be grown on it was poppy fields. Yeah, how about that for unexpected consequences? You can find out all about this in one of Adam Curtis's documentaries. British American says either Bob Odenkirk already had this arterial blockage during his intensive training for that stupid movie, in which case he would have face planted, or the blockage arose after his training when he was in peak condition. Neither makes any sense. Wasn't it rumored for a while that JLC was actually a man herself? Yes. Yes, that joke was so popular that it was actually made fun of on 30 Rock when Jenna said that the truth is that no, she doesn't have a penis. She has two butts. That was the real secret. Horrors by people who have lost their moral conscience. Some Catholic guy says no sleep till Breezewood, PA. Really? What else do we have here? Expect a surprise announcement of his death from, wait for it, inflammation of the heart lining with no available hearts for donation on hand. I haven't been following this too closely. I don't. Was he involved in some strenuous activity? Wasn't he on the set of Better Call Saul? Or was he doing something else? Because there's, not much strenuous activity involved on the set of Better Call Saul, although we saw him, have an episode, as they say, a panic attack that led to him fainting at his job at the donut place or whatever it's called. People will remind me what it's called. And he had to be taken to the hospital, and it turns out, it was just one of those things that happens to a middle-aged man who has, fled the law and assumed a new identity. And then someone from the place where he left shows up, and people seem to know all about him, and they seem to be planning something against him. Yeah, I could see how that would happen. Remember back when every tweet Trump had was marked as disinfo, said Oscar Toe. Yes. Dan says, Nobel also invented dynamite, a much better reward for, well, I won't mention that name. Jaakko Raipala, our Finnish friend, says, strangely enough, the Social Democrat Party in charge has resisted vaccine passports and our lockdowns were mild. The Greens and the right-wing opposition went crazy, corona totalitarianism. Well, that is sad to hear. But of course, when I hear, when I hear in Scandinavia about so-called right-wing parties, I think it seems to mean, of course, Finland is not Scandinavia, of course, that it seems to mean something a little different. Essentially, it means we don't want our country overrun tomorrow. I mean, completely overrun. And we don't want Sharia law instituted. That seems enough to make one right-wing. Up near the Arctic Circle, Pink Noodle says critical theory is the new church. They require it, for original sin, but contrast that they will never offer forgiveness. Yes, that's a point I've been making for some time. That apparently, slavery or white supremacy or whatever is our original sin, but there's no Jesus that's going to come along with a new covenant. And that's the sting in the tail. You're just going to have to be kicked around forever and feel grateful that worse is not done to you. Did someone mention Disney? And Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine and Audio Slave, he posted a couple of years ago a picture of himself at Disneyland, and someone gave him something to put around his arm saying that he was a member of the Rebel Alliance or something. The employees at Disneyland earn minimum wage. And of course, Disneyland is a place where a whole bunch of them were fired in order to train their foreign replacements. Disneyland, do you like standing in line for hours and hours and hours? Then you'll love Disneyland. I never really saw the point myself. Americans are being subjected to a Gitmo predicate, says Darren Beattie, the editor-in-chief of Revolver News. This is an essay with Steve Bannon, which is on Rumble. And essentially what he's arguing is that, the bad Americans, the wicked ones, the ones who voted for Trump, essentially are being reclassed as domestic terrorists by the Biden administration. And of course, since they're domestic terrorists, then anything can be done to them. Max Abrams writes in The American Mind, the Biden administration is using concerns about terrorism to crush Trump and supporters. If the U.S. government has a genuine interest in reducing domestic extremism, then its recent behavior has contradicted the advice of the academic literature. If, on the other hand, the government is concerned with persecuting Trump supporters and demonizing Donald Trump himself, then its behavior is exactly as you would expect. Political scientists have concluded that aggrieved people commit acts of terror because terrorism works, not because the perpetrators are bloodthirsty sociopaths. What it means for terrorism to work and how to measure success remain matters of debate. In theory, the effectiveness of terrorism could be evaluated by whether the violence pressures government concessions, extends the longevity of groups, fosters social solidarity within them, or destroys the national economies of target countries. Well, I'm reminded of the terrorism outbreak in Algeria in the 1990s, which crippled the country. And it got so bad that eventually the Algerian army had to commit its own acts of terror, false flag acts of terror, in an attempt to discredit the terrorists. And, oh, yes, let's hear from an idiot. That would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This is from Mary Margaret Olahan at WorldNet Daily. Clips of a leaked CNN interview published by Project Veritas show Democratic New York Representative AOC saying she thought she was going to be raped at the Capitol riot. In a video clip published by Project Veritas Tuesday, AOC told CNN's Dana Bash that she is a survivor of sexual assault. I do not believe her, noting that she has not told many people that. AOC is one of those people who, if she were painting her toenails and messed it up, the whole world would find out. There's no filter between anything that happens to her or anything that she thinks and the world finding out about it. The New York Democrat previously announced in February to her 9 million Instagram followers that she is a survivor of sexual assault, arguing that those who say it's time to move on from the Capitol riot are, quote, using the same tactics of every other abuser who just tells you to move on. For a lot of sexual assault survivors across the country, the decision to come forward oftentimes does not feel like a conscious one. That impact was doubled that day because of the misogyny and the racism that was so deeply rooted and animated that attack on the Capitol, white supremacy and patriarchy are very linked in a lot of ways. There's a lot of sexualizing of that violence. And I didn't think that I was just going to be killed. I thought other things were going to happen to me as well. It sounds like what your didn't only think, I'm sorry, this is not my mistake, this is WND, that you thought you were going to die, you thought you were going to be raped, Bash said in the interview. Yeah, Ocasio-Cortez responded. Is she, I suspect she's one of those women who's addicted to, what's it called, Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which is, it's just rape fantasies. The whole show is a prurient celebration of rape fantasies. They canceled all the other Law and Orders, but they kept the one about rape fantasies. But I guess they know their audience, right? And okay, okay. Let's go to the New York Times again, and let's look at, not their article lionizing Snoop Dogg, but the one from Krugman, from Paul Krugman, that how COVID became a red state crisis. Yeah, sure it is. Sure it is. This is the exact opposite of the truth, but that is exactly what one would expect from Paul Krugman. In any case, it's crucial to understand that we aren't facing a national crisis. We're facing a red state crisis with nakedly political roots. You see, just like Trump voters decided to end democracy in the Constitution on January 6th with their insurrection that involved no weapons or barricades, and everyone went home after a couple of hours, funny kind of insurrection, it appears that Trump voters are determined to kill non-Trump voters. So clearly, they must be dealt with. That is the planted axiom in Krugman's column. This would appear to be Michael Anton week at the KMG show. And he has a book review in the Claremont Review of Books of a book called Texas versus California by Kenneth P. Miller, a history of their struggle for the future of America. And I guess we're talking about secession again. Anton talks about the migration from California to Texas becoming a flood. As a result of the 2020 census, red states will gain 3 congressional seats, meaning blues will lose 3. California is losing 1 for the first time in its history. The fastest growing states are nearly all solidly red, or at the most fuchsia, e.g. Arizona, Nevada. Everyone knows someone who's moved to Texas or Florida. Many of us know several. I should have mentioned this yesterday, but all of this mockery from Canada of Florida, as it turns out, the Quebecois are very fond of Florida indeed. Perhaps not all of them vacation in the winter in Florida or have second homes in Florida, but it certainly seems like that sometimes. So we see this equivalency from the author of this book, Miller. Anton sees much of value in the book, but he's not buying the equivalency argument at all. Miller claims that both states have flourished in recent years. Have they? Anton asks. Leave aside for the moment the population question. Texas is attracting, California shedding residents as more effect than cause. Miller builds his case for a flourishing California along familiar lines: its handful of world-dominating industries, its influence on the broader culture, top-shelf attractions and institutions, and alleged quality of life. Only with respect to the first is Miller really on strong ground. Big tech and Hollywood certainly are enviable assets if one's foremost concerns are GDP and national and global influence. What they do for California's dwindling cohort of ordinary middle-class citizens is harder to see. Yet, given California's extremely progressive tax structure, 1% of the state's earners pay more than half the income tax revenue, These industries and their leaders disproportionately contribute to the state's massive welfare bureaucracy. But how much does that really matter to the average Joe? California's implicit message is similar to former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg's description of his city as a luxury product. Sure, it's expensive, but expensive because it's awesome. And if you can't afford it, that's because you're a loser. In California, supposedly, one pays a lot to get a lot, but what does one really get? As William Vogeley pointed out in detail a dozen years ago, California's public services are not merely expensive, but also inefficient and incompetent. The state's real governance model is the big spending, high taxing, lousy services paradigm. Things have gotten worse since then. Some of California's man-made amenities, the two Getty museums, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Palace of the Legion of Honor, the San Francisco Opera, or nearly world class for those who care about such things. Other wonders, such as Yosemite, can be attributed to progressive governance only in that the original progressives preserved these extraordinary natural resources. California's greatest asset, the weather, is similarly a gift of God and nature. Miller doesn't mention the state's crumbling infrastructure, the homelessness and crime in its major cities, nor the myriad other ways the Golden State's quality of life for all but moguls and tech lords continues to plummet. Indeed, in certain precincts, public order has all but collapsed. Brazen thieves routinely enter stores with garbage bags and pillowcases, fill them with loot, and stroll out unchallenged. Walgreens alone closed 17 San Francisco stores in the past 5 years because of shoplifting, a crime the authorities no longer even make a pretense of deterring or punishing. In my recent book, The Stakes, I dedicated the first chapter to the decline of California, describing the state as crowded, costly, congested, crumbling, incompetent, filthy, dangerous, rapacious, profligate, suffocating, prejudiced, theocratic, pathologically altruistic, balkanized, and feudal. Granted, I was making a semi-polemical case against the Californication of the entire country, which our elites from Joe Biden on down say they want. But if my portrait emphasized California's warts, Miller's feels a little airbrushed. Everything in the book points to an eventual showdown, and while the climax lacks the excitement of, say, High Noon or Shane, Miller does not disappoint. His last chapter speculates as to the future of the two models, both in terms of their competition with one another for residents and businesses, and the implications of the rivalry for national politics. But his summary of the relative strengths and weaknesses of each approach feels rigged in order to seem even-handed. Can both models really be equal? Not in the sense of identical, but due to the net advantages and disadvantages of California v. Texas really balance out so that in the end, the choice of one or the other comes down to simple preference? That seems to be the conclusion Miller wishes to draw, but his own summary tells against it. And the conclusion that Anton comes to is that there's going to be a battle for the future of America between the California model and the Texas model. Anton argues that the competition were allowed to play out, one suspects that Texas would win in a rout. The only people still moving to California are immigrants, aspiring starlets and screenwriters, and techies dreaming of their first IPO. One wonders how long even the latter migration will last as the tech sector increasingly disperses to other climes, not just Texas, but also Nevada and Florida, to escape California's punitive taxation, overregulation, and overall incompetence. Palo Alto is still fine if you can afford it, few can, but San Francisco has become a disgusting mess and priced only slightly lower. Many are asking who needs it and answering with their feet. But as Miller hints but refrains from bluntly explaining, the competition will not be allowed to play out because California won't let it. Miller's even-handedness, which mostly serves his book well, breaks down when he insinuates that both states seek to use their influence at the national level to drive federal policy and ultimately to impose their model on the other. The first half of the formulation is true as far as it goes. What state doesn't send legislators to Washington hoping they'll influence policies in ways favorable to its interests? But the second is flatly false. Put simply, California wants to rule Texas, but Texas doesn't want to rule California, and especially doesn't want to be ruled by California. These irreconcilable desires set the stage for a great clash sooner or later. The divide is most clearly visible with respect to energy, Anton argues. This is Texas's largest economic sector and a non-trivial part of California's economy. Yet the two states see the sector very differently. California's history is intertwined with energy. The oil industry, in a sense, built Los Angeles. Kern County is still home to some of the most productive oil fields in the nation, and Chevron, founded in San Francisco in 1879, remains the state's third largest company by revenue. But California is embarrassed by this legacy and prefers to emphasize various green technologies that, as yet, don't generate much beyond hype. Texas, by contrast, is proud of its oil men and seeks to maximize the benefits from its booming energy sector to the state's economy, workforce, and treasury. If Texas and California could simply each go its own way, drill baby drill, versus yet another solar panel, peaceful coexistence might be possible. That's the way Texans see things. If those left coast fruitcakes want to pay $5 per gallon and suffer rolling blackouts, fine with us and enjoy. But Californians see Texas as a mortal threat, not merely to their state's business model and way of life, but to humanity itself. Drilling is killing. Texas cannot be allowed to be Texas because if Texans got their way, the planet will superheat, destroying us all. You may think that's ridiculous hyperbole, and maybe it is, but Californians believe it and will not be talked out of it. Hence, peaceful coexistence is for them possible only on their terms. So then we have a short discussion of the Civil War, and Anton argues that America is more divided in 2021 than it was in 1861. And he concludes, while both states have interesting and inspiring histories, only Texas seems to take its to heart. The spirit of the Alamo still burns in Texans in a way that one hopes the spirit of 76 still burns in American hearts. There may come a point when Texans stop simply wishing California would buzz off and mind its own business. If the Lone Star way of life is to survive, Texans must fight for it. Then we shall see whether California's long experiment with postmodern deracination and anti-masculinity can stand up to Texas's more robust embrace of the old virtues. I'm not a betting man, but were that conflict to erupt, my money would be on Texas. Let's have more from Hilaire Belloc's The Servile State before we get to the book club. Belloc writes, the fixing of a minimum wage with a definite sum fixed by statute has not yet entered our laws. This was written in 1912. But the first step towards such a consummation has been taken in the shape of giving legal sanction to some hypothetical minimum wage, which shall be arrived at after discussion within a particular trade. That trade is, of course, the mining industry. The law does not say no capitalist shall pay a miner less than so many shillings for so many hours' work. But it does say, figures having been arrived at by local boards, any miner working within the area of each board can claim, by force of law, the minimum sum established by such boards. It is evident that from this step to the next, which shall define some sliding scale of remuneration for labor according to prices and the profits of capital, is an easy and natural transition. It would give both parties what each immediately requires: to capital a guarantee against disturbance, to labor sufficiency and security. The whole thing is an excellent object lesson in little of that general movement from free contract to status and from the capitalist to the servile state, which is the tide of our time. Collective older principles as abstract and doctrinaire, the immediate need of both parties immediately satisfied, the unforeseen but necessary consequence of satisfying such needs in such a fashion, all these which are apparent in the settlement the mining industry has begun are the typical forces producing the servile state. Consider in its largest aspect the nature of such a settlement. The proletarian accepts a position in which he produces for the capitalist a certain amount of economic values and retains out of that total a portion only, leaving to the capitalist all surplus value. The capitalist, on his side, is guaranteed in the secure and permanent expectation of that surplus value through all the perils of social envy. The proletarian is guaranteed in a sufficiency and a security for that sufficiency, but by the very action of such a guarantee, there is withdrawn from him the power to refuse his labor and thus to aim at putting himself in possession of the means of production. Such schemes definitely divide citizens into two classes, the capitalist and the proletarian. They make it impossible for the second to combat the privileged position of the first. They introduce into the positive laws of the community a recognition of social facts, which already divide Englishmen into two groups of economically more free and economically less free. And they stamp with the authority of the state a new constitution of society. Society is recognized as no longer consisting of free men bargaining freely for their labor or any other commodity in their possession, but of two contrasting status, owners and non-owners. The first must not be allowed to leave the second without subsistence. The second must not be allowed to obtain that grip upon the means of production, which is the privilege of the first. It is true that this experiment is small in degree and tentative in quality, but to judge the movement as a general whole, we must not only consider the expression it has actually received so far in positive law, but the mood of our time. When this first experiment in a minimum wage was being debated in Parliament, what was the great issue of debate? Upon what did those who were the most ardent reformers particularly insist? Not that the miners should have an avenue open to them for obtaining possession of the mines, not even that the state should have an avenue open to it for obtaining such possession, but that the minimum wage should be fixed at a certain satisfactory level. That, as our recent experience testifies for all of us, was the crux of the quarrel, and that such a point should be the crux, not the socialization of the mines, nor the admission of the proletariat to the means of production, but only a sufficiency and a security of wage, is amply significant of the perhaps irresistible forces which are making in the direction for which I argue in this book. There was here no attempt of the capitalist to impose servile conditions, nor of the proletarian to resist them. Both parties were agreed upon that fundamental change. The discussion turned upon the minimum limit of subsistence to be securely provided, a point which left aside because it took for granted the establishment of some minimum in any case. Next, let it be noted, for it is of moment to a later part of my argument, that experiments of this sort promise to extend piecemeal. There is no likelihood, judging by men's actions and speech, of some grand general scheme for the establishment of a minimum wage throughout the community. Such a scheme would, of course, be as truly an establishment of the servile state as piecemeal schemes. But as we shall see in a moment, the extension of the principle piecemeal has a considerable effect upon the forms which compulsion may take. The miners' refusal to work, with the exaggerated panic it caused, bred this first tentative appearance of the minimum wage in our laws. Normally, capital prefers free labor with its margin of destitution. For such an anarchy, ephemeral though it is of its nature, while it lasts provides cheap labor. From the narrowest point of view, it provides, in the still competitive areas of capitalism, a better chance for profits. But as one group of workmen after another, concerned with trades immediately necessary to the life of the nation, and therefore tolerating but little interruption, learn the power which combination gives them, it is inevitable that the legislator, concentrated as he is upon momentary remedies for difficulties as they arise, should propose for one such trade after another the remedy of a minimum wage. There can be little doubt that trade by trade the principle will extend. For instance, hang on just a second here. I got a notification here. As one group of workmen after another, concerned with trades immediately necessary to the life of a nation and therefore tolerating but little interruption, learn the power which combination gives them, it is inevitable that the legislator, concentrated as he is upon momentary remedies for difficulties as they arise, should propose for one such trade after another the remedy of a minimum wage. There can be little doubt that trade by trade the principle will extend. For instance, the 2.5 million now guaranteed against unemployment are guaranteed against it for a certain weekly sum. That weekly sum must bear some relation to their estimated earnings when they are in employment. Well, you see, what Belloc is describing here is the growth of what we now know universally as the wage slave. Most people in North America are wage slaves. As been pointed out, when you hear people tout, oh, small business is the engine of the economy. Small business is not the engine of the economy, for the reason that most small businesses have one employee, that people simply incorporate themselves. So they are not businesses employing people, as is traditionally understood. And we see that the capitalists, not content with the minimum wage, have been making the argument very successfully indeed. We need foreigners. We need millions and millions of foreigners. We bring them in on visas, which of course they overstay, because no, we can't get Americans to work at those wages. No, why don't you offer higher wages? Well, that would mean less profits for us, and that would be unfair, wickedly unfair. Oh, so your slaughtering house is full of illegal foreigners. Well, that's the only way we can make profit. No, it isn't. You can make plenty of profit. You just don't want to lose, I don't know. You don't want to lose 5 cents on every watermelon you sell. So that's why you need foreigners. You see that even with the minimum wage, we see that the capitalists have found a way to get around it. And let's go back to the chat. What happened with Luke Ford recently, says British American. He put out some sort of apology video, tried to watch it, but he had already taken it down. I don't. Rodion Raskolnikov says, if I make a donation, how do I know you won't spend it on drugs? I don't know if this is referring to me directly. You can rest assured, because I don't use drugs, and I have never used drugs in my entire life. If you think this is hyperbole, especially given my age, look around, see what I've written. Ask anyone who's ever known me. I found the 1970s to be a nightmarish decade because it seemed that everyone I knew at school and later used drugs. And everywhere you went, people were pressing drugs on you. And when you did not accept their kind offer of drugs, they cut up nasty and started calling you narcs and such, like tobacco. Is that a drug? Is that a drug? Maybe even caffeine. Quattro Longo says you do need an alternative to PayPal, perhaps KMG. Yeah, that's a nightmare that arrived on the horizon this week. I don't know. This system with the ADL, it hasn't been instituted yet. Has it? I don't want to go into too much detail about this for obvious reasons. But I'm going to have to deal with that. Dionysus says, I almost got into a physical fight at Walgreens over a face mask. I don't think I was the only one. Needless to say, they don't enforce face masks in the great state of Louisiana. This is how we roll. Contra coup, hello. In the red states of South Carolina and Florida, for the vast majority of people, it's basically like COVID doesn't exist. Life is going on practically unchanged. I don't know. Lots of people would like to live in Washington, Oregon, and California because of the weather, you know. But those places have gone crazy. Absolutely crazy. I am going to talk about that Seattle video because I have very, very fond memories of Seattle. And as a young man, I spent a great deal of time in Seattle. And what it's become is it's heartrending to me. But these people just can't help it. They just, it seems, I don't know whether it's inbred or whether it's something they acquire. They just have to root for the chud to win. And, you know, if they end up, you know, having their face pounded by the chud, you know, or being robbed or their property befouled, et cetera, oh, well, the chud can't help it, you know. Before I move on to the book club, I want to just read from something here. This is in the context of anti-Pope Francis's motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, which was published this week, which attempts to limit, last week, the use of the Tridentine rite of Mass. I'm reading from a piece from the Society of St. Paul X. It comes as no surprise because the Tridentine Mass, codified by Pope St. Pius V in 1570, is the perfect expression of faith and worship of the Catholic religion, which today is the sign of contradiction par excellence of the new religion of man championed by the innovators of the Second Vatican Council and thereafter. Rather than join the ranks of the hurried writers who have worked tirelessly to analyze and comment upon the motu proprio, I will read an extract of Archbishop Lefebvre, his famous sermon on August 29, 1976 at Lille. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre of holy memory was, of course, the founder of the Society of St. Pius X. He had formerly been the Director General of the Holy Ghost Fathers, which was a missionary order in West Africa. Catholic Church doesn't like to do missionary work anymore. Jesus commanded them to do so, but, the post-Vatican Church knows better. Lefebvre was eventually excommunicated by John Paul II. I'm not going to call him a saint, but his status of the Society of St. Paul X was in some ways regularized by Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. But of course, anti-Pope Francis considers Ratzinger to be the devil, a secular version of the devil, notwithstanding the fact that Ratzinger began his career as a peritus at the Second Vatican Council, one of the German liberals, and he has throughout his papacy attempted with his hermeneutic of continuity to somehow square the circle, which of course is impossible. But Benedict XVI is a good and holy man nonetheless. Archbishop Lefebvre asked, "What have the liberal Catholics been seeking for a century and a half? To wed the church in the revolution, wed the church in subversion, wed the church in the forces that destroy society, all societies, familial, civil, and religious. This wedding of the church is inscribed in the council. But it is the reign of our Lord Jesus Christ that we seek, and we profess our faith, saying that our Lord Jesus Christ is God. And that is why we also want the Mass of St. Pius V, because this Mass is the proclamation of the royalty of our Lord Jesus Christ. The new Mass is a sort of hybrid Mass, which is no longer hierarchical. It is democratic, where the assembly takes the place of the priest, and so it is no longer a veritable Mass that affirms the royalty of our Lord. This is why our ancestors built these magnificent cathedrals. Why did they expend so much wealth when they were so much poorer than we? Why did they spend so much time to build these magnificent cathedrals, which we still admire, even unbelievers? Why? To communicate the triumph of the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ in the Mass. But for that reason, we are driven from our churches. The poor priests are driven out for saying the old Mass, by which all our saints were sanctified. St. Joan of Arc, the holy Cure d'Ars, little Teresa of the Child Jesus were sanctified by the Mass, and now priests are driven brutally, cruelly from their parishes because they say the Mass which has sanctified saints for centuries. It is crazy. I would almost say it is a story of madmen. I ask myself if I am dreaming. How can this Mass have become some sort of horror for our bishops and for those who should preserve our faith? But we will keep the Mass of St. Pius V because the Mass of St. Pius V is the Mass of 20 centuries. I said to the Pope, that would be Paul VI, "Most Holy Father, give us back the public rights of the Church, that is to say, the reign of our Lord Jesus Christ. Give us back the true Bible instead of an ecumenical Bible, the true Bible such as was the Vulgate before and which had been blessed time and again by councils and popes. Give us back the true Mass, a hierarchical Mass, a dogmatic Mass that defends our faith, and which was the Mass of so many centuries and which sanctified so many Catholics." They tell us, "You judge the Pope." Archbishop Benelli threw in my face, "It isn't you who make the truth." Well, of course it isn't I who make the truth, but it isn't the Pope either. It is our Lord Jesus Christ who is the truth, and so we must refer to what our Lord Jesus Christ taught us, to what the fathers of the Church and the entire Church have taught us in order to know the truth. It is not I who judge the Pope, but tradition. A child of 5 with his catechism can answer his bishop very well. If his bishop were to tell him our Lord is not present in the Holy Eucharist, well, this child, despite his 5 years, has his catechism. He answers, "Well, my catechism says the contrary." Who is right, the bishop or the catechism? I read from this just to give some context to what might seem a parochial quarrel in the Catholic world. Just to emphasize the fact that the church that has existed since the Second Vatican Council it's a bastard church. It's a heretical church. It does not share the same ethos of the church before it. It is merely another worldly institution, which explains anti-Pope Francis's obsessions with climate change and migrants, the end of national sovereignty, of never Trumpism, etc., etc. He might as well be just another EU politician, but that is not what the Pope is meant to be. Okay, I'm going to move on to the book club now, and I'm going to be talking about an author called Irene Nemirovsky. I discussed her first novel, David Golder, on the old Luke Ford book club. And I guess I'm going to have to mention David Golder later because of this unseemly dispute which broke out after the publication of the novel that we're talking about today, Suite Française, of whether Irene Nemirovsky was an anti-Semite, or that is to say, a self-hating Jew. She was born in 1903 and died at Auschwitz in 1942. Her husband died at Auschwitz a couple of months later. She was born in Kiev, and her father was a banker, a wealthy man. And like many such people, they fled in 1917 and led a peripatetic life. They were in St. Petersburg. They fled from Kiev to St. Petersburg and then escaped to Finland and then in Paris. Nemirovsky studied at the Sorbonne, and she believed herself more than anything else to be a French woman. That is what she saw as her primary allegiance. She married a banker, as her father had been, and had two daughters. David Golder, which was published in 1929, was a huge success. It was made into a play. It was made into a movie, as was her 1930 novel La Balle. And Nemirovsky was on the right, very much on the right, which associated her with the political forces in France, which were hostile to the Third Republic. And of course, the division in France with the Third Republic led pretty much directly to the disaster of 1940, and then the Vichy regime of General Pétain. And then, of course, after the liberation of France in 1944, it led to homicidal retributions. Now, Nemirovsky, the retributions against her, well, they can't be physical, of course, because she died in 1942. But I'll just mention that when years ago, I suppose after I first read Suite Française, which came out in a marvelous translation by Sandra Smith in 2006. And so I was looking for reviews, and I found a great many reviews, particularly from Jewish writers who seemed to revel in the fact that Irene Nemirovsky had in fact died at Auschwitz in 1942. And this was because she was a convert to Catholicism. Now, there are many people who complain that Suite Française. Now, it's really rather a miracle that we have this book, that it was published in 2004, which of course is 62 years after she died. It is a torso. It is supposed to be an examination of the effects of the Second World War, well, the German invasion, and what followed. It was a planned 5-volume work, a Tolstoyan or Dostoevskian work. She only managed to complete 2 volumes before she died, although she made notes on subsequent volumes. Of course, having died in 1942, and she wasn't really in a position to know how everything would turn out. But Nemirovsky is criticized roundly for David Golder because it's about a man based on her father, and he's rather an unpleasant man. But she has a lot of sympathy for him in the novel, and you see that this is a man he's determined to make his imprint on the world. He's determined to be a success, which are admirable things. But the reviewers, well, then and now, made much of the fact that of David Golder's his relations with his chief rival, also a Jew, that he regarded this man with contempt. And I thought, I don't know. I mean, if you've ever read of or witnessed relations between Jewish rivals, they're pretty heated, typically. And regardless of what they may say in public about each other, what they say in private is very different indeed. So I don't think that anyone could claim that David Golder is not true to life. But in Sweet Frances, the objection was exactly the opposite. Why aren't there any Jews in this book? Well, there aren't any Jews in Sweet Frances because it is an examination of the bourgeoisie and to the panic that occurred when the German army crossed the Seine. It deals with a specific class, although nannies and such like servants who are not members of the bourgeoisie are included in the book because they are part of these families. And Nemirovsky is just as withering about the French bourgeoisie as she was about the milieu of Jewish businessmen in David Golder. That was the way that she looked at life. I mentioned, I think yesterday, that she rather reminds me of Muriel Spark in this regard. Now, Muriel Spark was half Jewish or fully Jewish. That's what her son claimed about her in an attempt to hurt her in some way. A very strange dynamic there. But this gimlet eyes view of the world, there's no sentimentality in Nemirovsky's work. And it is really very refreshing. She attempts to show her characters in the whole, as much as this is possible. And we meet a rather grand family called the Parikans, who head out for Nîmes. And we meet various members of the family, Hubert, one of the sons, and Philippe, another son, who is a priest. And we meet an author, Gabriel Corte, who is a rather ridiculously pretentious fellow. And he has a mistress. And he is this is all too much for him. This panic, the panic and the squalor, the horror and the brutality, the cruelty, the theft, the murder. And, Gabriel Corte, he lives a life of the spirit, a life of art. And these horrible things that are happening, how can they be happening to him? And there's a very, how would I put it, a very impressive appreciation of the writer's dilemma in his treatment of Corte. Now, Corte is a character who is played for laughs to a large extent, But he is obsessed with the idea to protect certain of his possessions after he flees his rather fabulous apartments in Paris, above all his manuscripts. And then when he has finally found some measure of peace in a refuge far from Paris, he looks at his manuscripts in despair because the world is different now. And the type of prose, the type of novels which had been considered, up to date, modern, well, after the catastrophe that had engulfed France in 1940, his work was immediately out of date. And he thinks that I already changed my style once when I was a younger man, and I'm simply not up to doing it again. So what is my future? Do I have any future at all? The first part of the book, or volume 1, if you will, is called Tempest in June. And the second part about the occupation is called Dolce, or Sweet. There was a movie made of Suite Française, but it had to do entirely with the second part. Now, this is a big novel, and I suppose we should be grateful that we got 40% of it. But it seems like one of the great tragedies of literature that we didn't get all of it. Because, as I say, it is a 360-degree view of a class, of an entire class in France. And Nemirovsky, being Jewish and being an émigré, she was not a member of that class, despite, she rubbed against it. Her father was quite rich, and she took vacations, with their family in very wealthy places in the south of France. But, as an outsider. But this was often the case, and it was true, very true, of Nemirovsky, that is an outsider who has the most important things to say about any particular milieu. Because people who are part of a class, it's like the old joke about the fish not recognizing water, that they take so many things for granted, that things that would seem strange or immoral or even crazy to outsiders, they're simply a second nature to those people. There is, as I mentioned, Nemirovsky was a Catholic convert, and there is a priest. There's a priest, Philippe, in this novel. By all accounts, Nemirovsky's conversion to Catholicism was a sincere one, and indeed, the priest who brought her to the church was later martyred by the communists in Romania. And there is a subplot in this novel about the priest and his dedication to the unfortunate, particularly the penitent children of the 16th arrondissement, a charitable organization which seeks to minister to a group of people, I suppose, that we would call juvenile delinquents. And I'm going to read from this just to give you a flavor of the novel and Nemirovsky's great grasp of human character. And so that morning, this is Father Philippe, stopped in front of a gray building and entered a courtyard that smelled of cabbage. The penitent children of the 16th arrondissement were lodged in a small private residence set behind a tall administrative building. As Madame Pariquin explained in her annual letter to the friends of that charitable institution, founding member 500 francs per year, benefactor 100 francs, member 20 francs. The children lived in the best possible material and moral conditions, were apprenticed to a variety of trades, and participated in healthy physical activities. A small glass lean-to had been built onto the house, providing a carpenter's workshop and a cobbler's bench. Through the window panes, Father Pariquin saw the round heads of the little inmates look up for a second when they heard his footsteps. In one part of the garden, between the steps and the lean-to, two boys aged 15 and 16 were working with a supervisor. There were no uniforms. The institution hadn't wanted to recall the prisons already known to some of them. They wore clothing made by charitable people using leftover wool. One of the boys had on an apple green cardigan that revealed his long, thin, hairy wrists. In perfect discipline and silence, he and his companion were digging the earth, pulling out grass, repotting flowers. They nodded to Father Pariquin, who smiled at them. The priest's face was calm, his expression stern and a little sad. But his smile was very sweet, slightly shy, with a kind of gentle reproach. "I love you," it seemed to say. "Why don't you love me?" The children were watching him, saying nothing. "What beautiful weather," he murmured. "Yes, Father," they replied, their voices cold and forced. Philippe said a few more words to them, then went into the house. Inside it was gray and clean, and the room where he found himself was almost bare, containing almost 2 cane chairs. It was the reception room where the charges would have visitors, a practice tolerated but not encouraged. In any case, almost all of them were orphans. From time to time, some neighbor who had known their dead parents, some older sister living in the country, would remember them and come to visit. But Father Pariquin had never met a living soul in this room. The director's office was on the same floor. The director was a short, fair man with pink eyelids and a pointed nose that trembled like an animal's snout when he smelled food. His charges called him the rat or the tapir. He stretched both arms out to Philippe. His hands were cold and clammy. "I simply do not know how to thank you for your kindness, Father. You are really going to take charge of our boys?" The children had to be evacuated the following day. He'd just been called urgently to the Midi, to his sick wife's side. "The supervisor is afraid he'll be snowed under, that he won't be able to manage our 30 boys all alone." "They seem very obedient," Philip remarked. "Oh, they're good boys. We get them into shape, teach the rebellious ones how to behave. But without wishing to seem proud, I'm the one who keeps everything going here. The supervisors are afraid. In any case, the war has claimed one of them, and as for the other," he pouted. "Excellent if he follows a rigid routine, but incapable of taking any initiative whatsoever. One of those people who could drown in a glass of water. Anyway, I was wondering which saint to pray to in order to evacuate those boys when your good father told me you were passing through, leaving tomorrow for the mountains, and that you wouldn't refuse to help us." "I'll gladly do it. How are you planning to get the children out?" "We've been able to get a hold of 2 trucks. We've got enough petrol. They're going somewhere that is only 50 kilometers from your parish, you know. It won't take you too far out of your way." "I'm free until Thursday," said Philippe. "One of my brothers is replacing me." "Oh, your journey won't take that long." "Would you do the honor of having lunch with me, Father?" Philippe declined. He'd arrived in Paris that morning, having traveled through the night. He was worried that Hubert might do something hot-headed and come to get him, but the family was leaving that very day for Nièvre. Philippe wanted to be there when they left. An extra pair of hands wouldn't go amiss, he thought, smiling. The point of all this is, and this is mentioned with regard to his mother as well, and various other people who commit acts of charity, that there is a kind of pride that people often take in charity, and the pride that people take in charity nullifies the spiritual value of it. But it's a very strong temptation to think, oh, look at me, look at the sacrifices that I'm making for others. Doesn't this make me a better person, a superior person? Here's more. the pitiless gaze of Father Periquin. He lowered his eyes, joined his hands, and placed his fingertips on his lips. His face took on an expression of harshness and sadness as he looked into his heart. He disliked these unfortunate children. He walked towards them with all the kindness and goodwill he was capable of, but all he felt in their presence was coldness and disgust. Not a single glimmer of love, nothing of that divine feeling which even the most miserable of sinners awoke in him when begging for forgiveness. There was more humility in bragging atheists, in hardened blasphemers, than in the eyes and words of these children. Their superficial obedience was terrifying. Despite being baptized, despite the holy sacraments of communion and penance, no divine light illuminated them. They were children of Satan, without even enough spirituality to elevate themselves to a point where they desired divine light. They didn't feel it, they didn't want it, they didn't miss it. Father Periquin thought tenderly of the good little children to whom he had taught the catechism. He had no illusions about them, of course. He knew very well that evil had already planted solid roots in their young souls, but at certain moments they showed such promise of kindness, of innocent grace, that they trembled with pity and horror when he spoke to them of the passion of Christ. He was eager to get back to them. He thought of the first communion they would celebrate the following Sunday. This torso, if you want to call it, is absolutely tremendous, in my view. It is one of the finest novels that I have ever read, and one that repays repeated reading. Given her own milieu, Nemirovsky was obviously a great noticer. That there are a great many writers who will essay only narrow fields of human existence, but as far as the bourgeoisie goes, it all seems to be in sweet Française, and this has my highest recommendation. And again, I must salute the outstanding translation by Sandra Smith. All of Nemirovsky's works are now available. After the publication of Suite Française, there was a Nemirovsky boom, which shows no sign of abating. And it's one of those things that can't be predicted. Which writers are going to fall from favor? Which writers previously obscure are going to be considered major? Again, life is full of surprises, and that's one of the things that keeps me going. Anyway, let's have a look at the chat before I sign off for the week. Media Hit says, I wonder if David Cole Stein will even finish his documentary about Mel Gibson's father, with the DVD having the entire interview in the extras. I didn't know he was making an interview about Mel Gibson's father. Who else do we have here? What do you say the same thing about the anti-pope believes the Muslim invasion to Europe just a cultural exchange, as Dionysus? Would he say the same thing about the Crusades? Anti-Pope Francis famously commanded Catholics to make a mess. Yes, he actually said that. He also mused about maybe he's going to cause a schism. He's a grossly irresponsible man. And I do not think that he had proper formation, as they say. Dionysus kind of reminds me of Stendhal's The Red and Black. Contracoup says, KMG, get a crypto wallet, Bitcoin, etc. address so we can support the show even if PayPal shuts you down. Well, I will do that. And thank you so much for your suggestion. Yo Mama says the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is over 1,600 years old. Yes, I'm well aware of that. In fact, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Uniate Church, that I attend uses the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Chrysostom means golden mouthed, by the way. I prefer the Western liturgy because that's what I know. But the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is good. It's very good, of course. Very reverent. And why doesn't Bud love the Chud? Asked Yo Mama. I've never seen the second one. I saw the first one, and which I thought was absolutely delightful. Very good. John Hurt is in it, and what's his name? Daniel Stern is in it, who I quite like. Yeah. No, it was a delightful movie. Chuds. I like the coinage as well. Obviously they came up with Chud first, and then cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers. Media Hit says David Cole interviewed him over a decade ago, but promised to not release the interview until Hunter Gibson passed away, which was last year. Okay. Steve Saylor accepts cash at a post office box. You could try that too, says Ogansire. Well, thank you too for that suggestion. Greatly appreciated. So what is coming up next week? I'm going to be talking about rockers over 30 on Music Monday, that there is a steep fall off in their quality, and I'll give examples. Now, I've already run into some trouble over this. Do you mean you can't make amplified music with drums and bass? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, shaking your fist at the world and saying, this will not stand, or man, women, what are you going to do about them? Or I just love you, baby, so very much. Or any kind of histrionic gesture, it just seems pathetic in men over the age of 30. The luckier ones manage to transition to something more mature. On Theater Thursday next week, I'm going to be discussing a movie from 3 years ago set in Los Angeles about conspiracies. It is called Under the Silver Lake. And on the book club next week, I'm going to be, and this was a suggestion from a reader or listener, greatly appreciated, a man who's going to help me understand more about Japan. And his name is Lafcadio Hearn, and he wrote many, many books, which you can get all of them for a couple of bucks now. I'm trying to remember the name of the company that publishes collected editions for tiny amounts of money, but I will mention it during my review. So I'm going to be talking about Lafcadio Hearn on the book club next week. Thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate it. I will be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, well, PayPal still works, and the ADL has not extended its tentacles into it yet. My PayPal account is attached to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.